Shanghai, one of the largest symbols of modernity in China. Over the course of history, Shanghai has developed as a city for all things modern, especially when it comes to modern art. It all began during the 1920s and 30s, which is known as the Heipai era. During this time, many parts of China had been set in retaining old practices and ways of living in spite of the Opium Wars. In contrast, however, Shanghai sought to change that through the adoption of Western cultures and fusing it with traditional Chinese culture to create a more modern Chinese city. The Heipai era brought about new and notable concepts and ideas in several areas of art, such as literature, architecture, and film. However, I think the two most intriguing areas of art during this time are the introduction of Chinese jazz and the changes in fashion. In this video, I would like to expand on these two areas and how they still play an impact on Shanghai today. Jazz music, also known as shidashi, was a music genre adopted from Western jazz. During that time, Shanghai had a mixture of citizens from Chinese and Western cultures, and many jazz musicians from the West would perform in Shanghai dance halls and ballrooms. The two Westerners are most regarded for bringing jazz to Shanghai were Whitey Smith and Buck Clayton. Whitey Smith was a famous drummer from San Francisco who grew to fame in Shanghai. He is best known for his book, I Didn't Make a Million, in which he highlights his experience in Shanghai. Buck Clayton was an African-American jazz musician who rose to fame in Shanghai while playing trumpet, being that he struggled in the United States to do so. In Shanghai, he organized many ensembles and performed in many Shanghai dance halls. Now, when it comes to shidashi itself, this style of jazz combines Western jazz styles and instrument play with traditional Chinese song and dance styles. A prime example of this is in the music of Li Jingwei. Li Jingwei was a Chinese composer and songwriter who lived from 1891 to 1967. Coming from a family of composers and songwriters, Li Jingwei took his knowledge of Chinese song and dance and utilized it when creating shidashi. It was revolutionary to many Chinese people, being that jazz originally seemed foreign. However, Jingwei's music provided a sense of familiarity, and as a result, he is often regarded as the father of Chinese pop music. He also received that name being that shidashi started to become more mainstream in the 1930s and 1940s. There were other famous musicians such as Yao Li, a Chinese jazz singer who rose to fame as a result of the creation of radio, and Xiao Sang, another famous singer of the time. Shanghai fashion was also transformed during the Heipai era as a result of Western influence. Prior to that period, Chinese tailors would utilize expensive materials such as silk to create very elongated and decorated clothing such as the hanfu. However, In the Hi-Pi era, many Chinese tailors and manufacturers changed from traditional material to cheaper material, such as textile, to create clothing as it sped up the production process. The process also took less time to make, as Chinese fashion borrowed Western ideas of fashion to create shorter clothing, especially when it came to female fashion. An example of this is in the Yipei, or the Jiaosang, known as the Manchu banner robe. This dress borrowed traditional patterning from past Chinese clothing and combined it with Western fashion to create a more modern Chinese style of fashion. They often varied in length, whether by sleeve or dress length. They were very popular as fashion became a driving force in advertisement for products such as music, cigarettes, film, and many more things. This era also saw the introduction of department stores as well as fashion shows. In addition to male fashion, many males still continued to wear traditional clothing. However, the Hi-Pi era saw the introduction of the Xiangpao, as well as the introduction of suits. The Xiangpao was a long gown, usually worn by scholars, older men, urban men, and those alike. It originally emerged from the Xiangsang. The outfit existed before the Hi-Pi era, but was changed drastically during the Hi-Pi era with the introduction of pockets. In terms of the introduction of suits, the Hi-Pi era presented the sun chasset, a wool suit inspired by Western-style uniforms. The jacket was made with buttons, trousers, and pockets, all new clothing components to Chinese fashion. It was often worn by military cadets and school children. Both Hi-Pi jazz and fashion took over Shanghai by storm, as ideas of consumerism were emphasized greatly. It brought Shanghai into this era of modernism, which was different compared to the rest of China, and made it a hotspot for commerce and culture to many Western people and countries outside of China. Both were popularized and played a huge role in other forms of media, such as film and advertisement. However, both changed drastically during the 1950s to 1970s due to the rule of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party. Jazz was labeled as yellow music, or music that was obscene or prerogative, and as a result, it was banned. Many jazz music records were confiscated and lost as a result. Many other forms of art were also banned, being that the Maoist government demanded militarism over the freedom of expression. Fashion during this time was designed to buy into this idea of militarism. Take, for example, the Mao suit, also known as the Jiangsan suit. It was a uniform inspired by USSR outfits. Its colors were considerably dull and simple, usually blue or gray, to buy into the lack of freedom of expression. It was mostly worn by men, but was also worn by women. Dress codes were very strict, and everyone was expected to wear these formal and uniform clothing. At the end of the Maoist period, the 1980s and onwards saw a resurgence of art that sought to adopt art that had been lost during the Maoist period. and integrate it into modern styles of art. In terms of jazz, the genre served the purpose of entertainment for many Western audiences and visitors, as it was performed usually at hotel lobbies and cafes. Western jazz performers would still travel to China in order to perform. The genre also saw many Chinese musicians who had learned jazz from the West arrived in Shanghai to perform and pay tribute, such as Lawrence Chu, Joey Liu, and Kong Hong Wei. Other genres of music drew and still draw inspiration from styles of Shi Dai Shi. Take, for example, lo-fi music or EDM. Shanghai Restoration Project, an electronic music group, adopts jazz into their creation process. Two examples are in the album The Classics and the song The Wandering Songstress. Another example would be in pop music with Teresa Tang. Teresa Tang was a pop artist during the 1980s and 1990s who would often use jazz in her music. In Chinese fashion today, it borrows styles of clothing from not only the Hai-Pai era, but also from Chinese eras prior. For example, today people continue to wear the cheongsam as it remains very popular. Many Chinese people will often wear it at occasions such as award shows and marriage ceremonies. Many embroidered wedding dresses are based on the designs of the yipei and cheongsam. In addition, many of the fashion trends from the past were also adopted into modern clothing and have inspired new styles of fashion. Take for instance, the Chinese knot, which is used in combination with Western style outfits such as suits and jackets, and operates similar to a zipper. Another example is the Tang suit, which provides a modern twist to Chinese fashion from the Ying dynasty. Also similar to the Hai-Pai period, modern styles of clothing are borrowed from the West. Take a look at some of these outfits, for example. In summary, the two genres of art from the Hai-Pai period played an impact not only on Shanghai of that time, but continues to pay dividends into today's Shanghai.